Profiting from Misery, South Africa's Complicity in War Crimes in Yemen. That's the title of a research published by a local non-profit organization, Open Secrets. It details Rheinmetall Denel Munitions their involvement, at least, in supplying arms to central parties in the war in Yemen. The company is part owned by Denel, with the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. According to the National Conventional Arms Control Committee, the export of weapons should have been prohibited. Now, Michael Marchant is a researcher at Open Secrets and joins us now to discuss their findings. Good afternoon to you, Michael. Thank you so much for your time. So, of course, the research has now uncovered what it has. What then is essentially Open Secrets and those who are against the profiting of the war happening in Yemen asking for?
Afternoon, Morena. Thank you for having me on the show. I think that the answer for us is very clear, is that the authorities in South Africa, predominantly the National Conventional Arms Control Committee, which is the regulator of arms exports in South Africa, needs to apply their minds to the evidence that our weaponry exported by companies operating in South Africa may be ending up in Yemen and being used in conduct there that amounts to violations of international law and war crimes. South African law on this is very clear. South Africa should not be permitting the export of weapons where they may end up worsening conflicts and being used against civilians. And we think that the evidence here is strong enough to demand that the regulator and the South African state and our Department of International Relations looks at this issue very, very carefully and ends this practice.
Michael, the government says to Open Secrets, we're just a provider of arms. You know, we're not saying that the war happening there and the killing of civilians is right, but we're just providing arms. If we don't do it, someone else will.
It's certainly true that we're not the only country doing it. And so countries like the United Kingdom, the United States, Germany, and others have been long-term suppliers of weapons into this conflict. However, it is very clear from the reports before the United Nations that it is not only Saudi Arabia and the UAE who may be guilty of war crimes, but the United Nations has made clear that those supplying weapons, despite knowledge of what they might be used for, may themselves be complicit under international law of international crimes. And I think South Africa has had a very clear stance, certainly since the democratic era, of specifically setting up an arms trade that does not aim to become complicit in these types of crimes. It's also important to point out that while certain other countries have been supplying weapons to the conflict, even those countries are increasingly starting to halt that supply. So you spoke early on about Rheinmetall Denel Munitions in South Africa. Its parent company in Germany, Rheinmetall, is prohibited from supplying weapons to Saudi Arabia explicitly because of what is happening in Yemen. And so we're very concerned that South African corporations and South Africa as a jurisdiction may be being used by other countries in order to circumvent their own restrictions and bans on exports to these states.
I'm sure you would agree, Michael, that people have become desensitized to such stories of war crimes and such crises, especially in countries like Yemen, in the Middle East. For them, this has been happening for years, for decades. We're used to it, and it's not going to stop. But how bad is the situation? If somebody's now wanting to know, okay, so Open Secrets is saying that there should be a change of policy in terms of exporting of weapons to such countries. How bad is that situation in those countries?
So the situation in Yemen is catastrophic, and I don't think that is an exaggeration. If you look at what has happened there over the last 5 or 6 years in the civil war, we're talking about not just the fact that the targeting of civilians by armed forces, but you're also talking about the wholesale destruction of the infrastructure that people rely on to live. And so we are talking about up to 15, perhaps more million people facing starvation and lack of food, and almost complete inability of Yemeni civilians to access healthcare, which was devastating enough before COVID struck, and they had to deal with that as well. And so the United Nations and other groups have declared Yemen to be likely the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe today. And so it is absolutely essential that South Africa doesn't find itself complicit in these types of crimes. I think it's also important to state that while Yemen may seem very far away to many South Africans, that South Africa itself has a history of knowing what it is like for international players to be complicit in crimes committed against them. The apartheid state relied on the support of arms dealers and countries around the world who were willing to supply arms and other support despite knowing that it was a crime against humanity that was being committed in this country. And that was the basis on which the South African state said, we will do things differently as a democracy. We will not partake in these types of crimes, even when they happen in places geographically very far away from us. And that's why if we want to maintain that commitment and actually base our foreign policy and our conduct on the basis of human rights rather than profit, it's essential that we stop this kind of support to Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Just before I let you go, Michael, does Open Secrets know if the export of weaponry is happening in other countries from South Africa, not just Yemen?
There's certainly evidence. During the stage 1 lockdown last year due to COVID, we know that weapons were going to Turkey, and there's certainly concern that Turkey may have been using those in places like Syria and Libya. And we also supply a range of regimes, such as Egypt and otherwise, where there is a concern around human rights violations. So Yemen is a particular concern right now, but we are a widespread supplier of weaponry, and if the NCACC is not applying their minds to this case, there's certainly a concern about whether they're applying their minds in every case of exports from South Africa.
All right, Michael, thank you so much for your time. That is Michael Marchant, a researcher at Open Secrets.